The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Diversity and the pursuit of artistic dreams. I'm Nam Kiwanuka, and tonight on the Agenda in the Summer, artist Vivic Shraya on making connections that cultivate change. Ambition, competition, and what it's like to be a person of color building a career in music and art. Such are the huge themes that occupy author and artist Vivic Shraya in her new novel, The Subtweet. She's an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Calgary, and she joins us now from the Stampede City for more. Hi, Vivic. Welcome back.
Hi, Nam. Thanks so much for having me.
It's really nice to see you considering the times that we're in. But this new book actually came out in April 2020 after the coronavirus was declared a pandemic, a global pandemic. What was it like for you to promote a book during a pandemic?
I mean, very bizarre. And sometimes, to be honest, it has felt quite selfish. I'll go online and I'll see, the death count of the world is such and such. And then I'm supposed to, tweet about my new book. And it has felt a bit strange. And I mean, I'm constantly reminded by people around me that, art is so important and that people are looking for, alternative kinds of news in their feed. But I think, when the pandemic was first announced, I was still kind of hopeful too. I was like, oh, well, maybe my book tour will still happen. And I learned very quickly that wasn't going to be the case. So, yeah.
You said that you felt selfish promoting a book when the world was people were dealing with so much uncertainty. And yes, you worked on this book for a while, and the timing just happened it came out when it came out. Did you allow yourself, and not to, I'm trying to be careful how I ask this because people have died from this. And when you do look at the bigger picture, we're healthy, we're doing okay. But did you allow yourself space to grieve for that moment in your life where something that you had worked on for a long time and you weren't able to celebrate it in the way that you might have been able before everything happened?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting that you bring up the word grief because that's the word my therapist has been using as well. But again, I think you're right to note that grief is a complicated word because we tend to associate it with death, which is very much a reality right now with this virus. But I think for me, there's the feeling of selfishness, but then there has to be space for multiple feelings to exist. And I think it has felt important to me to honor the feelings of disappointment. On top of the book, I was supposed to take my play to Germany this summer as well. Just sort of like big opportunities as an artist that don't always come by. And again, I think that, the thing that I've had to learn about difficult emotions in my life is that you can try to pretend like you don't have them, which sometimes makes those feelings worse. And sometimes the only way to get through a difficult emotion, even if it is selfish, is to actually just acknowledge it. So I think it was really important for me to say, I'm disappointed that this isn't going to play out the way I hoped it was going to.
Well, I mean, in late April, the subtweet actually became a bestseller. And you tweeted, overjoyed that a book that centers on brown women and friendship is officially a national bestseller. What did that mean to you for the book to become a bestseller, especially considering everything that was going on?
Again, a bit strange. I even, talked to my partner is like, is this inappropriate to be tweeting? Like, I've seen a lot of people say a strange time to celebrate good news anytime people post good news, because I think none of us want to come across insensitive or be insensitive to the reality of the situation. At the same time, I think it's important for us to be trying to find some light during this time. And I think for me, this particular book was such a challenge to make happen, to get published, largely because of the fact that it centered brown women and because it was about social media and the concerns about social media dating the book. And so for me personally, it felt important to be like, hey, a book that, you know, there was some sort of doubt around whether or not it would actually connect with people. It's great to see that actually this book can connect with others.
Considering the obstacles that you've just mentioned that you went through to write the book, why did you want to tell this story?
I mean, first of all, I really wanted to write about friend breakups. I think that, you know, we know as a culture, like there's a sort of space to process romantic relationship breakups. There's sometimes even a form of accountability. Like we know that texting each other when we break up, or like texting a breakup is a faux pas, even if we do it. But with friend breakups, it's like, you know, sometimes people just ghost, or you just drift away and you don't always know what happened. But there's so much pain around that. And sometimes it can take years to get over a friend breakup, but there's not always the same kind of cultural space. So for me, it felt really important to have a book that explored the pain of losing a friend specifically. And so, simultaneously, I also wanted to write a book that centered brown women, you know, like, and 30-something brown women who aren't like, you know, obsessed with finding a man or having children. And again, there's nothing wrong with those things. But I think so much of what we see in terms of women in pop culture, in books, in films, is a certain kind of, as soon as you hit 30, you know, you get married, you have children, and it's a particular kind of narrative. And a lot of my single women friends, you know, we do talk about relationships, but we also talk about art and we talk about our careers. And so that was something else that felt really important in this.
Yeah, at one point in the book, I don't want to give away too much of the book. At one point in the book, one of the characters mentions, I think, what we all think about when we think about female relationships, which is Sex in the City, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, and I was just going to say, and Sex and the City is such a great example because on one hand, you know, there are these four independent, strong women, but when they get together and they meet, they're often talking about the relationships with men. And, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the Alison Bechdel test or something like that. It's like a test that was set up a couple of years ago. I don't have a lot of the details, but essentially it's sort of like, you know, if you can watch a scene in a film where two women are together and they're not talking about a man, then it passes the test. And so few films that feature women in a scene talking to each other actually do pass that test. And so for me, that was sort of a bit of a benchmark for the book as a whole.
Initially, these four friends are quite tentative towards each other. Was that about trust, or was it about identity?
I think it was about. I think making friends. I'm going to guess we're sort of in the same age range here, but I feel like
I think you're younger than me, but okay, sure, I'll take it.
Well, I feel like the older, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel like the older we get, the harder it is to make friends. And we don't really talk so much about this because there's this idea that your friends are people that you just have in your life and you have friends forever. But, you know, as a 30-something, like I've just found that making friends, like outside of school and outside of, you know, mostly outside of school, it's very, very hard to make friends. And so I think it is about trust in your, like, and I think you suddenly start to have certain requirements because you already have certain kinds of friends that check off certain kinds of boxes. And for me, the other thing that was really important to explore in this book was the way that now making friends is inevitably impacted by social media. It's very strange to meet a new person and then suddenly get to access a lot of information about them just by Googling them, as opposed to asking them questions and learning these things firsthand. And so for me, I thought of social media as kind of like a third character in the book, and how these characters, the two main characters, how their friendship is always mediated by this silent third character, or this like outside lens in which they're learning things about each other at all times and developing friendship through that, if that makes sense.
Well, the book is called The Subtweet. What is a subtweet?
Great question. Okay, let's see if I can do this. So a subtweet is often a remark about somebody, but without mentioning who it's about. And it's often it can be seen as a bit passive aggressive. It can seem almost like insulting. So, you know, if after this interview I were to, you know, tweet something like, nothing like doing an interview with someone who hasn't read your book before, you know, and obviously you've read the book, but I'm just saying, like, and then it's like you would go online and you follow me and you'd be like, oh, is she talking about me? Like, but I could be like, oh no, it's about anyone. It's just a vague comment. So subtweeting has become this kind of form of, like, again, I think people see it as very passive aggressive, but sometimes it's a way to speak truth to power without being able to talk to power. So if, you know, if you were my boss, but I didn't feel like I could have a direct conversation with you, but I might be able to just say something about you on Twitter vaguely, I might do that. And so I think it's become very commonplace, but at the same time, it can cause for a lot of paranoia because people are often like, oh, is she subtweeting me right now? And people can always deny that they're subtweeting you. They could be like, no, that wasn't about you.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the characters actually says a subtweet is an act of resistance. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases it can be an act of resistance, right? So I think, you know, I might say something like about white people, right? I might be like, white people never blah, 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 whatever. And again, I might mean it generally, but I might have also had a terrible experience, you know, with a white person in my life who has more power than I do. And I might not have the ability because of the power dynamic to actually talk to them about it directly. And so sometimes just subtweeting about white people just feels easier. So I think that's what that character is sort of getting to, is in some cases, subtweets can be like an act of resistance.
Well, there's between the two, there's two main characters, and in their relationship, there is love and there is this misunderstanding, and it plays out all on social media. The internet is a place where we're supposed to be, you know, authentic, show who we are, yet it's a place that's rife for misunderstandings. Why do you think, what you say in the book, you call it internet ambiguities? Why do you think these internet ambiguities thrive on social media?
Well, I mean, to your point, I think the difficult thing about social media is, like, yes, on one hand, we're supposed to be authentic, but I do think the culture of social media is really about the highlight reel, right? Like, you seldom see, I mean, I remember once a friend of mine posted a photo of herself crying, and I was like deeply disturbed. And I was like, wait a second, why is it that if a friend is crying on social media, it's very uncomfortable, but, you know, friends like going on vacation and, you know, smiling and partying, that's all very acceptable. And it's because that's what social media is about. Social media isn't actually in a lot of ways about being authentic. It's about a curation of, you know, a very one-dimensional part of your life. And I think the hard thing about that is that what that means is we're constantly making assumptions about each other based on a one-dimensional perspective of someone's life. So I look at your photos and I'm like, oh wow, Nam looks like she's having the time of her life. She's out there, you know, she's got like an amazing look all the time. Her hair looks amazing all the time. And meanwhile, you know, you might be at home struggling with mental health and not talking about those things. And sometimes posting a selfie is actually a way for you to feel better about yourself. And so I think for me, the biggest thing about the book is like wanting to encourage people to think about how we can interact with social media and other people's content with a lot more kindness, and by giving people the benefit of the doubt and not always just making assumptions based on what we see, because what we see isn't always true.
Well, I mean, studies show that women of color, trans women receive the brunt of hate on social media. Yet social media is also where you connect with your audience and where you can find your community. How do you then navigate that space, a space where you yourself have received death threats?
Yeah, I mean, again, great question. It's such a strange place for that reason. Like, on one hand, it's one of the only places to connect with others like you in a particular way, and simultaneously, it's also a place where you get like a very intense form of hatred, especially if you're marginalized. And I think for me, it's meant establishing certain boundaries, you know, with social media, and understanding, like, for instance, right now, because of the pandemic, I find that, like, you know, a lot of what causes me a lot of the speculating. So you go on Twitter and people being like, I think we're going to be in this for 3 years. And then I get very anxious about it. And so there's the news aspect, which is like really intense, but then also the speculating, which is really intense. And so for me, for my mental health, I've been like, okay, I'm not checking social media more than 2 times a week if possible. And I think that rule in general has been important, because or those kind of boundaries, like I don't have social media apps on my phone. I have to go on a computer and log in, because that extra step means that I'm not just sitting and clicking and like looking at things and then comparing myself and being like, oh, this person's doing this person's amazing, what's wrong with me, why am I not baking bread right now, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think for me, it's really about boundaries.
You know, something happens in the book. Again, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it yet.
I appreciate
But
that.
one of the characters wonders if call out culture is the same as trolling, which to me is such a, I've never actually considered that. Is call out culture the same as trolling?
Well, let's ask my characters. No, I mean, I don't know. It's difficult as someone who's been both trolled and been called out. There are definitely times where it doesn't feel that different, and I think part of it is that with call out, there is a kind of uh, going for blood that sometimes feels that like I think again I kind of like subtweeting. I feel like call out culture or calling someone out can be a very important act on the internet. And again, I think especially when people are in power, when people are calling out our government, I think that these things, or people are calling out arts industries, these gestures are so important, and call out has been an amazing way to increase dialogue or cultivate change. But when I've had call out happen, it's often from other people in my communities, and that can feel quite devastating because um, often it feels like, well, why couldn't we have just had a conversation? And that's not to say that there isn't a power imbalance within communities. Certainly, as someone with a platform, I have, I guess, a certain kind of power and certainly a kind of privilege. But sometimes call out, it can feel relentless, and it can make attacks on your character and who you are as an individual. And again, that sometimes doesn't feel that different than trolling. And so I think by my character asking the question, I'm not saying call out culture is bad, and I'm not trying to place that kind of value, but I guess what I'm trying to get us to think about is like, how might we call out or hold people responsible, or hold people accountable, especially in our communities, but do it with a kind of respect, if not kindness, so that it doesn't just feel like trolling.
Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's pick up the phone. Like I have had interactions with individuals where I have felt offended by something that they have done, or I have done something that has offended them. And I think that maybe it's because I grew up in the '90s, but it's like there's something about actually hearing voice and remembering the humanity of someone that feels so important. And I think one of the things we've lost with social media and the internet is that people have forgotten. We forget that there's a human on the other end of that tweet or that picture or that comment. And for me, by picking up the phone and having a conversation with someone, it reminds both parties, look, we're humans and we're trying to learn something. And if anything, I find that like intimacy can then be built. Whereas in call out, seldom is intimacy built. Trust isn't built through call out. Whereas when you actually have conflict with someone in a respectful way, your relationship can actually deepen and grow, which I think is beautiful.
The book is also about making it in a dominant culture music business. Are some of these events drawn from some of the things that you've experienced as a musician?
I mean, it would be impossible for me to say no to that question because, certainly I've been in the music industry, in the Canadian music industry for, 18 years. And as someone who, hasn't necessarily had the kinds of success that the characters in the book has, I certainly have a lot of experience and I certainly drew from that experience. But, to me, the book was most joyful when I wrote it from a perspective of not writing what I know. There's that old saying, like, write what you know. And I actually I scribbled on the top of a piece of paper, this is only fun when it isn't about you. And so I really tried to lean hard into writing characters who thought a little bit different than me or felt different than me. Neela, for instance, one of the main characters, is very anti-social media. And I'm, despite what I'm saying about social media, I'm not actually anti-social media. And so it was really interesting to write someone who was like very standoffish about it, who was kind of snobby about it. So yeah, I mean, I think that the book definitely pulls from my experience, but I really tried to challenge myself by writing outside of me, if that makes sense.
Well, a word that's become part of the lexicon in the past few years is diversity, and
I've
in the
never heard
book,
that word before.
what? And in the book, you write in a couple of ways, which I found were really thought provoking. You write about the diversity stock market, and one of the characters wonders about whether a concert tour offer is a diversity invitation. Is this something you worry about, that your worth is now is linked to the X's that you cross off a list when we are all talking about the importance of diversity, and diversity is part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, yes. When I get invited, and I don't know if you have this experience too, but like when I get invited to be on a panel, I'm often like, am I getting invited because someone respects the organizers or the festival respects and values my work, or is it because I check off queer, trans, brown, you know? And then when I get to the panel and there's like three other white people and me, and then I'm like, ah, okay, that is exactly why I was invited, you know? And again, I think that it is very nebulous. Like I've also been on the organizer end of that equation, and I do think it is challenging. Like how do you organize from a perspective where you're not just checking off boxes? But I think part of it is like making sure that the organization on every level reflects a certain kind of diversity, as opposed to just the front facing like artists or talkers or speakers. So yeah, and I mean the diversity stock market, you know, I do think that is something that a lot of us who are you know, racialized and marginalized think about, is like, okay, well, we have a certain kind of commercial or cultural capital now. What happens, you know, in 5 years when diversity isn't so trendy, right? So I definitely see a lot of like younger artists, especially, making all kinds of choices around their careers because they understand that a part of why they might be valued is for this particular, or for particular boxes that they check, which is really awful. You know, I think it speaks to the ways that so much of the work around diversity in Canadian industries has been important, but at times has still felt like it has been about a trend.
Well, you said the new artists are making these choices, because one of the characters actually throws a charge like that to someone else in the book. Is there such a thing as performative diversity to appeal to the dominant culture?
Um, Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I did a project last year called Trauma Clown where I talked a bit about how, as an artist, you know, I often have felt like the only way that or one of the ways in which I've gotten support from audiences and from larger institutions is by revealing trauma. And the more trauma that I've revealed, the more support I've gotten. And I've sort of like traced that relationship throughout my career. And that's not to say that I've shared my trauma deliberately to get support, but I certainly understand the pressure too. So, you know, again, I can't speak on behalf of any other artist, but I can say personally, you know, we talked about my book, I'm Afraid of Men, last time I saw you. And I think one of the things I really struggled with that book is like, you know, should I be including a story of sexual violence for this book to be taken seriously? And I think that that's really, I think that's really awful. I think that, like, you know, marginalized artists should be able to write from a place of truth and of inspiration without having to feel like the only way our work is valued is if we, you know, talk about how hard it is being brown or how hard it is being trans or how hard it is being queer. And again, that's not to say that talking about those things are bad or wrong, but they should be our choice and not so much a choice made out of pressure or a desire to stay relevant.
And now I think when we have an idea of, you know, when we think of what an intellectual is, we have a certain image that comes up in our mind. But the characters in your book are intellectuals, and they're grounded in feminist theory, contrasting what, you know, people can see as one-dimensional quality of social media. Why was that a choice that you made?
I mean, again, I really wanted to write smart characters, like smart women, you know, who, again, aren't just sitting around and talking about men, talking about relationships, talking about their nails. And I mean, again, listen, I love talking about a good blowout. I love talking about makeup. But I think that those things are held against us. You know, women are so often are portrayed as superficial, and only caring about superficial things. And I think that does a disservice to women in general. So I think for me, it felt really important to write strong women characters and
And
smart
you,
women characters.
and you've created an imprint, VS Books, with Arsenal Pulp Press, and you've put out a call to writers over 50, which is unusual because I think whenever we think of, you know, writers, it's the young ingenue, 20, 25. Why did you want to do this?
Well, this is the third open call we've done for the imprint, and the imprint, just some background information, is essentially set up to support one emerging author every year or year and a half that is Black, Indigenous, or of color. And I set that up because, with every stride I make in my career, I want to make sure that I'm creating space for people, who are marginalized, who are still facing the kinds of barriers that I faced in my career when I first started. But this particular iteration was really inspired when I was touring with the first author we published, Hamatanji, and having conversations with older writers who were like, what about us? And by older, I mean like 50 plus. And it made me think about how, in our culture, we really equate emerging with youth or being young. And how that's not actually true, and that, one of the things that like I've benefited from and younger artists have benefited from are these conversations around diversity, right? Like I can be critical of them, but at the same time, I know the ways that I've benefited from them in the way that older generations, there weren't necessarily these kinds of open, large conversations around diversity, or at least support for these conversations. And so I think in thinking about the, lack of opportunities for older writers, the way that, we do live in an ageist culture that really thinks that if you haven't made it by a certain age, you're irrelevant or your viewpoints aren't important. I thought it would be really important, even as a conversation starter for this year, the open call to be for 50 plus BIPOC writers, so that we can start thinking about how we might actually start supporting or providing more supports for older writers and artists.
Vivic, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
I love the book. Thank you, and stay well. And I can't wait to see what you create next.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for your fantastic questions as always.
Thank you. Coming up Monday on the agenda in the summer.
For the other 6 siblings, it was about either wondering whether you were going to go insane next, or wondering who else would be next, and not being sure exactly of whether you could actually control the situation at all. And then trying very hard to send a message to your parents that you weren't a problem, that you weren't going to become mentally ill. So that meant a certain amount of perfectionism for some of the kids who weren't mentally ill. And then some of them tried to leave as soon as they could, and then, came back when they could. You had a certain hypervigilance that they all share even to this day. All of the Well siblings do. They're all very different people, but they all are sort of on their guard, because how couldn't you be growing up in that house?
That's Monday on the agenda in the summer. And that's it for tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again next time.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.